Chapter 1. The Impossible Crime. It was on a bitterly cold morning in early February that I was roused from my reading by the peculiar arrival of Inspector Tobias Gregson. The fire in our Baker Street sitting-room had only just been coaxed to life by Mrs. Hudson, and I was still in my dressing-gown, poring over the latest issue of the Lancet, when Gregson burst in without so much as a knock. His hat was streaked with sleet, and his mustache bore icicles. Holmes, lounging in his armchair with his violin balanced lazily on his knee, regarded him with one eye half closed and the barest hint of a smile. "Trouble, Gregson?" Holmes inquired. "More than you can imagine," the inspector muttered, sinking heavily into the nearest chair and casting a sidelong glance at me, as though reluctant to speak freely. "I wouldn't have come if it weren't, well, quite outside the ordinary." Holmes set down his violin. "You forget, my dear fellow, that quite outside the ordinary is the very condition that draws me out of my chair." Gregson leaned forward. "Do you know the name Superintendent Harold Moxby?" Holmes' eyes twitched the way they did when a name stirred recognition. The former overseer of the Lambeth Watch Division, decorated for defusing the Netherton riot, recently transferred to lead the Southern Rail Security Force. "That's him, or rather was. He's dead." "Shot?" Holmes asked immediately. Gregson blinked. "No." "Poisoned?" "No." "Then allow me to assist you. You are here because the cause of death defies your understanding, yet the circumstances suggest foul play." "Spot on," Gregson muttered almost grudgingly. "He was found this morning in the signal tower at Blackbridge Junction, locked from the inside. No marks on the body, no weapon, not a soul near him, and not a single sound reported by the guard on duty." Holmes leaned forward. "And yet you believe it to be murder." "We do, because Moxby was due to blow the station's emergency whistle at precisely 3 a.m. to test the response time of the patrol units. But he didn't. The whistle wasn't blown, and when they broke into the tower at 3:11, they found him dead, slumped over the table with the whistle in his hand. Not a mark on him. But his face, Holmes's face, was frozen in absolute terror." There was a long silence. Even I, seasoned by many of Holmes' cases, felt a shiver at the image. Had he any history of illness? I ventured. Gregson shook his head. "Fit as a horse. I've spoken to the man's doctor. No heart problems, no epileptic fits. Nothing of the sort. And if you think he simply dropped dead of fright, then tell me what frightened him." He was alone, inside a locked tower, with only one narrow window. Holmes stood, finely animated. He moved to the hearth, folded his hands behind his back, and stared into the flames. An unexplained death in a locked room during a precisely timed act that failed to occur, he murmured. Then, louder, "Watson, coat and gloves? This is no ordinary whistle and no ordinary crime." Gregson hesitated. "Will you come to Blackbridge, then?" Holmes turned, his eyes alight. "At once. I should like to see the body before the trail goes cold. Have it not been moved, if you can help it, and the whistle ensure it remains untouched." "It hasn't left his hand," Gregson said grimly. "That's part of the problem. The constables couldn't pry it from his fingers. Rigor mortis, the coroner said, but it's odd. It's clutched in such a way that, well, you'd think he had just lifted it to his lips." Holmes was already moving, collecting his coat with impatient gestures. Come, Watson, let us see what silence can tell us about. A whistle that should have been heard. And with that, we were off into the London morning, leaving our warm fire behind, for the riddle of a man who died without a mark, holding the instrument that might have saved him, yet never made a sound. Chapter 2. A Whisper Beneath the Rails. The ride to Blackbridge Junction was a bleak one, made more so by the dreariness of the mid-morning mist that clung to the rooftops like cobwebs. We sat in silence for much of the journey, the rhythmic clatter of the cab wheels punctuated only by Holmes' occasional hum, an unfinished motif, played endlessly on his inner violin. "I confess," I said at last, "that I find the situation baffling. If the door was locked from the inside and the whistle was never blown, is it not possible that Superintendent Moxby suffered a sudden collapse, perhaps a stroke or an embolism?" Holmes glanced at me with a wry lift of the brow. "You fall into the same trap as Scotland Yard, my dear Watson. A locked door is no guarantee of isolation, and a whistle left silent may have been silenced deliberately. You suspect someone entered. Unseen?" "I suspect only that our perceptions are limited," Holmes replied. "That is why we must examine the scene, not merely for what is there, but for what is missing." We arrived at Blackbridge Junction just before noon. The station, tucked at the edge of the southern line where it split toward the docks, was more industrial than public, a nexus of freight trains and maintenance crews. Fog clung to the signal towers like smoke from a dying engine. Inspector Gregson met us at the platform, flanked by a pair of uniformed constables who looked deeply unsettled. "We've kept the scene untouched, as requested," he said quickly. "Dr. Dillaby from the coroner's office is inside, but he agreed not to move the body until you'd seen it. There's a constable stationed outside the door since the discovery." "And no one has tampered with the whistle?" Holmes asked. "Still in his grip, exactly as it was found." Holmes nodded. "Excellent. Lead on." The signal tower stood apart from the rest of the station, a narrow red brick structure 3 stories high. We ascended a tight iron staircase, each step echoing with a metallic ring. The constable on duty saluted stiffly and stepped aside. Gregson unlocked the thick oak door, and we entered. It was a small chamber, barely large enough to contain the semaphore levers, a narrow work table, and a pair of stools. The room smelled faintly of oil and damp wool, and there, slumped over the table like a man dozing at his post, was Superintendent Harold Moxby. I approached slowly, heart thudding. The man's eyes were open wide, unblinking, and fixed with such abject terror that I felt a chill creep up my spine. His mouth was half open, as if he had drawn a final breath that never left his lungs. The whistle was in his right hand, clenched tightly, held just shy of his lips. Holmes stood behind me, still and observant. He did not speak. He merely walked the room once, his eyes scanning every inch ceiling, floorboards, levers, window, desk. He paused at the door and examined the lock carefully from the inside. "The bolt was thrown?" he asked. Gregson nodded. "Yes, sir. When the guards arrived, they had to break it down." "And the window?" "Only one in the room. Far too narrow for a man to pass through, and it's 15 feet up from the outside, with no ladder in sight." Holmes went to it nonetheless. He drew a magnifying lens from his pocket and examined the sill, the ledge, and the iron frame. Then, almost lazily, he removed a glove and ran one finger along the inside edge of the glass. He frowned. "Watson, your medical opinion. How long has he been dead?" I knelt beside the body, checking for lividity and stiffness of the joints. "Rigor mortis is fully established, suggesting death occurred 6 to 8 hours ago. That would place the time of death sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, consistent with the failure to blow the whistle." Holmes nodded, then leaned over the superintendent's head, peering into his eyes. "And yet there is no wound, no sign of struggle, no broken blood vessels, no swelling. But note, Watson, his pupils are dilated. He saw something. And whatever he saw, it stopped his heart. A hallucination? I offered. Perhaps he had some unseen affliction of the brain." "Perhaps," Holmes murmured, but his tone suggested he did not believe it. He turned to Gregson. "Has anything else been disturbed?" "Nothing. No objects out of place. There's a logbook, but Moxby didn't write anything after 2:30. Last entry reads, 'All lines clear.'" Holmes took the book and turned it gently. The last few pages were neat, precise, unhurried. He turned back to the whistle. "Why this particular test, Gregson? Why was Superintendent Moxby alone?" Gregson hesitated. "It was his own arrangement. He liked doing surprise drills, kept the patrols sharp. He told the guard not to check in until after 3:15 to simulate a lone dispatch scenario." Holmes looked down at the body, and for the first time I saw something flicker in his expression. Concern, yes, but also something more elusive, recognition. "Gregson," he said quietly, "I will need a list of all personnel who had knowledge of this drill beforehand. Even a whisper of it. Anyone Moxby might have spoken to in the past week. Of course, I'll compile it straight away. And Watson, we shall return tonight. I want to be here at precisely 3 a.m. I have a theory, and if I am correct, it is not only Superintendent Moxby who is meant to be silenced." Chapter 3. The first clues, a scene of deception. We return to Baker Street. In a pensive mood, Holmes said little throughout the remainder of the day, retreating to his armchair with a stack of railway maps and superintendent rosters, puffing furiously at his pipe. He was not idle, however. I noted that he had set no fewer than 3 telegrams to a watchmaker in Clapham, a retired signalman in Basingstoke, and curiously a theatrical supplier in Soho. As always, the deeper his silence, the more furiously his mind worked. It was just after 2 in the morning when Holmes roused me. "Come, Watson," he said briskly, "we mustn't miss our appointment with the dead." By 3 o'clock we had once again ascended the iron staircase of Blackbridge Junction's signal tower. The constable on duty, It was just after 2 in the morning when Holmes roused me. "Come, Watson," he said briskly, "we mustn't miss our appointment with the dead." By 3 o'clock we had once again ascended the iron staircase of Blackbridge Junction's signal tower. The constable on duty, a nervous young man by the name of Finch, saluted and unlocked the newly replaced door. Holmes entered and stood still in the center of the room, eyes closed, listening. "Silence," he murmured. "Listen closely, Watson. Tell me, what do you hear?" I cocked my head. The creak of the metal stair behind us. The wind against the glass. Exactly, but no train whistles. No semaphores shifting. No human motion below. It's nearly deserted, Holmes. Surely. Yet the schedule indicates a maintenance train was due to pass southbound on Line 3 at 2:58. Where is it? We waited in silence. No whistle came. No rattle of iron wheels on track. Holmes said nothing further, but I saw the tension in his shoulders died at length. He stepped to the window once more, examined the sill, then paced the floor, his steps measured. He stopped beside the table where Moxby had died and examined a black scorch mark on the wood, no larger than a coin. He scratched at it with his nail and sniffed his fingertip. Gunpowder? I asked, hopeful. Too faint, possibly phosphorus. Holmes opened a small valise he had brought and removed a curious device, a short rod with a mirror at the end. He used it to inspect under the desk, then behind the large semaphore levers. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "A deception," he said calmly. He found it 5 minutes later. It was no more than a sliver of linen cloth, tucked behind one of the iron levers, burned slightly at the edge, as though it had been exposed to a flame. Holmes held it up to the light. "Note the edge, Watson. Singed, but not consumed. Someone ignited this fabric and extinguished it before it spread, perhaps as a distraction, or a signal. I took the scrap from him. Could it have been meant to simulate smoke? Perhaps to frighten Moxby?" Holmes nodded slowly. A theatrical gesture, perhaps, but one made in a room where the window remained shut and the door locked. That implies our culprit had control over the timing and expectation of this illusion. We returned to the logbook. Holmes studied the final entry again. All lines clear. Too clear, he muttered. "This page, Watson. It is dry, flat, but look here on the preceding page, smudged ink. A ripple near the spine. Moisture, possibly from a gloved hand." He turned to the final entry again, but not a drop of ink out of place, as though it were copied, rewritten. "Are you suggesting someone falsified Mog's book?" I said, incredulous. "I suggest only this," Holmes said. "Either Moxby died before he could make that final entry, or someone ensured. It appeared that he did." I stood stunned. "But if that's true, then it would require access to the locked tower after Moxby's death." "Or before," Holmes corrected, "and concealment within." He looked at the iron levers once more. "I must speak with the station engineer. There are gaps beneath the gear, panels narrow, but wide enough to accommodate a determined man, perhaps even a boy." We returned to the platform level and found Inspector Gregson, bleary-eyed but still on duty. "You'll want to hear this as well," he told us, pulling us aside. "One of the porters, Keene, name of him, came forward an hour ago. Claims he saw a figure moving near the south signal yard around 2:30. Tall, dark coat, didn't recognize him. Figured it was Moxby on a check. But if Moxby was already in the tower, then the man seen was someone else," Holmes finished. "And he had reason to be there just before the test was meant to begin." Gregson hesitated. "That's not all. Keene also claims he heard a whistle, just one faint but clear. Said it came from the freight yard side, but he dismissed it. Thought it might be an echo from the river." Holmes turned sharply. "What time?" "About 2:50 by his watch." Holmes stood very still. Then he said, "Come, Watson. There's something we must examine before dawn breaks." We followed him around the back of the station, through the yard lined with oil barrels and stacks of timber, until we reached the track's edge. There Holmes crouched beside a crate, examining the snow-muddied gravel. He pointed. Footprints, 2 sets, one heavy, square-soled, the other lighter, possibly a woman's, and here, look, a faint circular indentation. I bent to examine. A matchbox? Possibly, Holmes said, though he seemed uncertain. He stood, eyes narrowing. Someone signaled from here. Not a whistle, but something that mimicked one. A decoy, which means whatever was meant to happen in the tower was contingent on a response. I stared at the signal box, now looming dark against the pale sky. But if no one entered or left the tower, then how was the final act carried out? Holmes gave a thin smile. Watson, my dear fellow, we are not yet dealing with a murder. We are dealing with a magician. Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects by midday, Blackbridge Junction was abuzz with speculation. Word of Superintendent Moxby's inexplicable death had spread through the station staff like wildfire, and despite Gregson's efforts to contain rumors, the talk in the mess hall was already turning to ghosts and curses. Holmes, ever averse to distraction, requested that those with any connection to the night's events be gathered in the foreman's office for individual interviews. It was a narrow, drafty room with a wide desk, a ticking wall clock, and a glass partition that looked out upon the railway yard. Holmes seated himself behind the desk, fingers steepled, while I took a chair at his right hand, notebook open. Gregson stood leaning against the far wall, arms folded, his expression unreadable. The first to enter was Miss Agatha Bell, the late Superintendent Moxby's personal secretary. She was perhaps 30, plainly dressed, with sharp gray eyes and a composure that seemed too deliberate. Her gloved hands were folded in her lap as she sat. I assisted Mr. Moxby for the past 14 months, she said. He was precise. Not especially warm, but efficient. Never once missed a scheduled report or inspection. Holmes did not look up from his steepled fingers. Did he speak of threats, disagreements, conflicts within the ranks? He had little patience for the new signaling proposals from central office. Believed automation would lead to carelessness. He said it would make men soft. Holmes's eyes flicked up. And did he trust his staff? She hesitated. He suspected someone of tampering with the duty logs? Nothing he could prove. Holmes nodded slightly. Did he confide in you regarding the emergency test? No, I found out about it the same day as the others. Her tone was calm, but I noticed a slight tremor in her voice when she mentioned the test. Holmes must have observed it too. That is all for now, Miss Bell. Please ask Mr. Ruggles to come in. Henry Ruggles was a squat, broad-shouldered man, with coal dust ground into the lines of his face. He was the yardmaster and had known Moxby for years. Good worker he was, Ruggles said, but stiff as a plank, no sense of humor. You were on duty the night of his death? I was checked the last cargo train myself. Everything clear at my end. Holmes leaned forward. Were you aware of the emergency whistle test? No, sir. Not until I heard what happened the next morning. And did you see or hear anything unusual around 3 o'clock? Ruggles scratched his head. Not a thing. But that stretch near the south yard, that's where sound plays tricks. The fog, the old bridge, it all echoes, like someone whistling, inside a tunnel when there's no one there. Holmes smiled faintly. Tell me, Mr. Ruggles, did you ever argue with Moxby? He shifted. He had his way of doing things. We clashed once or twice over the night schedule. He thought I was too lenient with the lads. Said one mistake would lead to a disaster. Holmes let the silence stretch before nodding. Thank you. That will be all. Next came Constable Alfred Keene, the man who had reported the mysterious figure. He was young, earnest, with sandy hair and a perpetually anxious brow. I swear to you, sir, I saw someone in a long coat walk along the southern boundary near the yard, around 2:30 or so. Couldn't see the face. I thought it was Superintendent Moxby checking the lines. You didn't call out? Holmes asked. Keene reddened. I didn't want to interrupt, sir. I figured he'd have barked at me for shirking. And the whistle? I thought I heard it, from the direction of the river, but faint. Holmes asked, was it the station whistle or a human whistle? Keene frowned. I think it was human, not metallic, like someone whistling with their mouth, maybe from behind a wall. Thank you, Holmes said. One final thing, have you seen anyone enter or leave the signal tower aside from the superintendent before the body was discovered? No, sir. Holmes nodded and gestured toward the door. Then came Percival March, the station's signalman. He was a gaunt, balding man with ink-stained cuffs and spectacles that magnified his eyes like a barn owl's. I was asleep, I'll admit it, he said with a dry cough. My shift doesn't begin until 4, but I live above the station. Heard a crash. That was them breaking down the door. Did you know about the test? Holmes asked. March shook his head. Never. Liked those late-night drills. Moxby said surprise was essential. Always kept us on edge. Did you ever quarrel with him? Only when he tried to reassign me to night signals. I told him I'd go blind pulling those levers in the dark. Holmes smiled. Mr. March, are you aware of any old access tunnels beneath the station? Passages? Storage rooms that might connect to the tower? March hesitated. There's the old coal chute, sealed off years ago. Used to run under the yard and connect to the boiler room. I doubt anyone's used it NADD. Very good, Holmes said, but there was no satisfaction in his tone. And how, pray, do you suppose he ensured Superintendent Moxby would not leave the tower before the scheduled test, or that he would be alone? Gregson hesitated. Well, perhaps he bribed someone to keep Moxby occupied. Holmes said. Ruggles does not strike me as a man of bribes and hidden tunnels. I know he's rough around the edges, but he could have done it. He had motive resented Moxby for tightening the schedules. Wanted him gone. Holmes turned sharply. Motive is not method, Inspector. Let us say, for argument's sake, Ruggles descended the chute, waited hours in a cramped passageway, and emerged undetected. He then somehow frightens Moxby to death. How? He brings no weapon, leaves no mark, and disappears like mist. And all this he accomplishes despite being in poor health note, his limp and labored breathing, and having a station full of men who could see him come or go. Gregson's face darkened. Holmes turned to me. Watson, do you recall the whistle Keene reported hearing? Not metallic, but human. I do. And Ruggles, could he replicate such a sound, given his coarse voice and heavy breathing? I very much doubt it. Precisely. No, my friend. We are looking for someone with agility, knowledge of theatrical effects, and access to both the old infrastructure and the superintendent's routine. Gregson scowled. You have someone else in mind? Holmes paused. Not yet, but I will have soon. As we walked away from the platform, Holmes turned to me. Watson, do you recall the young telegraph clerk, Miss Travers? Yes. She mentioned code words and outgoing messages. Holmes nodded. An unusual detail, don't you think? Most clerks are indifferent to the content of the messages they send. You suspect she knows more? I suspect she saw more than she let on. Come, we shall pay her another visit. Miss Lucy Travers was seated at her desk inside the Central Station office, tapping out a telegram as we entered. She glanced up, startled. Mr. Holmes, she said nervously. I wasn't expecting. Holmes raised a hand. Forgive the intrusion. I wonder if you could clarify something. You mentioned Superintendent Moxby asked you to watch for code words. Did he ever explain what he meant? She hesitated. He believed someone in the signal department was warning staff of his inspections, that they'd use ordinary words and messages, delayed or canceled, to cover their tracks. He asked me to report anything strange. And did you? One, sir. A message that came through from the Chatham yard a few days ago. It said timetable reversed. Proceed with caution. Do you recall who sent it? She paused, then leaned in. I shouldn't say. It was confidential. Holmes gave her one of his rare, warm glances. Miss Travers, a man is dead. And more may follow if we let politeness shield the truth. She bit her lip. It was signed A.B. Agatha Bell. Holmes's eyes sharpened, but his voice remained even. Thank you. You've been most helpful. As we stepped back into the mist-laden yard, I turned to him. You don't believe Miss Bell was involved in the crime? She may not have killed Moxby, Holmes said, but I believe she knows who did, and she's protecting them. He stopped suddenly. Watson, we must return to the old signal records tonight. There's something hidden in plain sight, and I dare say it concerns a timetable not reversed but rewritten. Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A hidden inconsistency that evening. After the station had settled into its rhythm of oil lamps, murmured telegraphs, and the occasional rattle of a distant goods train, Holmes and I made our quiet return to Blackbridge Junction. Gregson, still bristling from Holmes's skepticism earlier that day, had retired for the night, leaving us to our own devices. This suited Holmes perfectly. Armed with a lantern, a notepad, and an expression of singular focus, Holmes led us not to the scene of the crime, but to the records room, a narrow, stone-walled archive below the station master's office. Inside were stacks of logbooks, timetables, and communications ledgers dating back nearly 2 decades. Dust clung to the volumes like soot. Holmes set the lantern on the central table and opened a thick ledger labeled Railway Signal Orders, Southern Division, January-February. His fingers moved with practiced speed through the pages, scanning with a precision I had come to associate with both a surgeon's calm and a predator's intensity. I am searching, he murmured, not for what is said, but for what ought to have been said and isn't. I peered over his shoulder. The entries seem unremarkable. Routine messages, changes to cargo priority, weather disruptions, routine safety drills. Precisely, Holmes replied. And yet look here. He pointed to a series of entries for the 3 nights prior to Moxby's death. Each contained identical notations. Track 3, clear. All units stationed. Whistle test scheduled. Standby response at 3 a.m. Then, abruptly, on the night in question, February 4th, the line read only Track 3, clear. All units stationed. Notice what's missing? Holmes asked. I studied the line. There's no mention of the whistle test. Just so, Holmes said. Every previous test, even when conducted under the veil of secrecy, left a notation. An encoded version, yes, but still present. This entry omits it entirely. Could that be an oversight? Not for Moxby. His records were a study in obsessive exactness, which leaves two possibilities. Either Moxby omitted it intentionally or someone else made the final entry in his place. Holmes turned abruptly and pulled another volume from the shelf. Personnel access logs, dispatch tower. His finger slid down the list of names, dates and times of tower access, each signed and countersigned. There, he said. February 4th, 2:35 a.m. Entry. H. Moxby. Alone. He closed the book. Watson, if Moxby entered the tower alone at 2:35 a.m. and the scheduled whistle test was at 3 o'clock, yet he failed to note it in the logs, we must ask, did he know he would never complete the test? A silence stretched between us. You think he suspected something? I asked. Holmes was pacing now, rapidly, eyes glittering. I think he feared something. And I think he left us one clue deliberately omitted, not by accident, but as a warning. He turned to me. Do? You remember the scorch mark on the desk? The one I said smelled faintly of phosphorus? Yes. Holmes raised a finger. Now consider this. Phosphorus is used not only in matches, but in theatrical flash powder. What if Moxby was not frightened to death by a figure, but by a manufactured illusion? You mean? I mean, Holmes said, he may have seen a ghost. I stared at him. A ghost, Watson, not a supernatural entity, but a precisely constructed image. Consider. A dim room, flickering light, and a silent accomplice hiding below. A burst of light, perhaps a silhouette in the smoke. The illusion of an apparition. Enough to startle an already paranoid man, especially one who believed himself marked. But who would go to such lengths to terrify him? I asked. And why not simply kill him? Holmes paused. Because the fear itself was the weapon. A man can be stabbed, shot, poisoned, but fright? That strikes from within and leaves no trace. He lifted the lantern and turned to leave the records room. We must speak with Miss Bell again. But surely she would not. Holmes halted at the threshold. Not to accuse her, Watson, to understand her loyalties. We found Miss Agatha Bell in the clerical wing, seated at her desk with a lamp lit and several folders spread before her. She looked up, eyes weary but alert. Mr. Holmes, she said softly, you've come to ask me about the message. Holmes raised an eyebrow. You knew we'd find it? I suspected. Lucy Travers is diligent. Tell me, Miss Bell, what did you mean by timetable reversed? Proceed with caution? She closed her folder, the movement deliberate. It was a warning. Moxby had begun altering records, changing dispatch logs, but not to cover mistakes, to test people. He was creating errors on purpose, seeing who noticed. Did anyone? Holmes asked. I did. So did Percival March. But he kept silent. Why? She hesitated. Because he owed Moxby something, a debt from years ago, and because he feared him. Holmes sat across from her. And you? Were you afraid? "No," she said quietly. "I pitied him. He was a man hunted by his own mind." "Did he tell you about the figure he saw?" She blanked. "You know about that?" "I suspect he saw it more than once. A shape, a face. Something staged, but by whom?" Agatha Bell looked away. "Miss Bell," Holmes said gently, "I am not here to expose your secrets. But a man is dead, and I believe someone you know used fear as a weapon with your reluctant assistance." Tears welled in her eyes. "He didn't mean to kill him. He just wanted Moxby out." Discredited, removed from the post. Holmes leaned forward. "Who, Miss Bell?" She whispered it. "March." The name fell into the silence like a stone into water. Holmes stood slowly. "And he had the means." She nodded. "He worked in a theater before the war. Knew all the old tricks. Lantern projections. Smoke illusions. And he knew the tower better than anyone. Even the old escape hatch under the levered panel. It still opens." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, the ghost had a hand. Now we must find where it reached from." Chapter 7. The Crime. Grows stranger the following day, dawn gray and sodden. The London sky a thick quilt of low cloud that pressed upon the roofs like a weight of foreboding. Holmes and I returned to Blackbridge under a hush of drizzle, the roads glistening, the gaslights distorted in the sheen of moisture. The fog, never fully lifting from the south yard, gave the junction a dreamlike quality, unreal, half-formed, like a scene between waking and sleep. Holmes was silent throughout the journey, not withdrawn but entirely absorbed. His eyes flicked rapidly as if replaying S. Gregson led us to a small office off the main station house, where Miss Agatha Bell sat composed, hands folded, pale but resolute. A constable stood nearby, though she made no movement to flee. Her confession, it turned out, was not one of murder but of complicity. "She says she helped conceal evidence," Gregson said. "Knew March was planning something. Warned him when Moxby scheduled the whistle test. Claims she thought it was just a harmless prank and illusion to rattle the old man. She never imagined it would result in death." Holmes stepped forward. "Did she say how the illusion was carried out?" "A projection," Gregson said. "She mentioned March used a lantern with a special lens, painted slides, smoke for effect. Said he rigged it to flash at a precise moment." Holmes nodded, thoughtfully. "And what of March?" "Gone," Gregson said grimly. "Vanished from his quarters some time after midnight. We found his window unlatched and his bed untouched. Left behind only his spectacles and a single slide plate shard around the edges." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "And the subject of the slide?" Gregson hesitated, then pulled a cloth from his coat pocket. Wrapped inside was a cracked glass plate, blackened and warped, but still bearing the faint outline of a human face elongated. Ghostly mouth agape in a soundless scream. I felt a chill rise in me. "Moxby's wife," Gregson said. "Or a likeness of her. She died 4 years ago." Holmes took the plate carefully and examined it under the lamplight. So March sought to project Moxby's greatest fear into that sealed room. "Exactly, and now he's fled." Holmes did not look satisfied. He held the plate up once more, angling it slowly. "You say this was found in his room?" Gregson nodded. "Curious, too curious, in fact." He handed the glass back and turned abruptly. "Watson, with me. We must examine." the signal tower once more, and I want to see that trap panel under the levers. Gregson followed, muttering, "You still think we're missing something?" "I think," Holmes said quietly, "we are being misdirected." The tower stood unchanged, silent, rain-slicked, its single window like a lidless eye peering into nothing. Inside, Holmes went directly to the lever array and knelt at its base. With a flick of his hand, he revealed a small rusted hinge. It groaned as he lifted the panel. Beneath was a crawl space, narrow and black. "It leads to the foundation," he said, precisely as Miss Bell described. He lay flat and slid partially inside. I crouched to watch, holding the lantern steady. Holmes called from the dark, "Watson, bring the light closer. There's something here." I passed the lantern in, and Holmes withdrew a moment later, holding a small, canvas-wrapped object. He unrolled it gently. On the floor dot inside were 3 items: a narrow brass whistle, polished and clearly well used; a paper mask crudely painted to resemble a woman's deathly face; and a note. Holmes picked it up, read it, and handed it to me silently. "You taught me how to vanish. Now I vanish again. There are places beneath the city where the dead do not stay buried." P.M. I looked at Holmes. "A farewell?" "Or a performance," he said grimly. "Watson, think. If March had planned only to frighten Moxby, why take the whistle? Why the mask? And why this note left so conspicuously? It's too theatrical even. For a man of the stage." Gregson frowned. "Are you suggesting he wanted us to find it?" Holmes stood. "Precisely. This is not a man fleeing justice. It is a man laying the final stone in a carefully constructed illusion." He paced slowly. "Consider. Miss Bell confesses. March vanishes. A ghostly image left behind. The tools of the crime presented like exhibits in a museum. We are not investigating a crime, we are walking through a curated narrative." He turned sharply. "Which brings us to the most pressing question. Why?" I spoke slowly. "If Moxby wasn't the true target," Holmes nodded, "then March's trick was only the beginning. Something deeper lies beneath this death. A motive neither theatrical nor accidental. We have been looking for the killer in the wrong place." Gregson muttered, "Then where the devil should we look?" Holmes answered without hesitation, "Not in the tower, not in the tunnels, but in the past." He looked up at us both. "We must speak with Moxby's widow's sister. She lives in Clapham, does she not, Watson?" "Yes," I said, startled. "I believe she was mentioned in the obituaries, Mrs. Lydia Carr." "Then we go at once," Holmes said, "because whatever March was running from, it wasn't guilt. It was someone closing in behind him." Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. The rain had relented by the time we arrived in Clapham, leaving behind glistening rooftops and dripping eaves that whispered faintly into the wind. Our cab pulled up before a modest brick house set back from the road, a place with tidy hedges and lace curtains, the kind of home that suggested peace, routine, and little appetite for scandal. Holmes, however, was far from at ease. He was tense. In the seat beside me, fingers drumming softly on the lid of his walking stick, I had seen that look before, the calculating sharpness in his gaze when he was no longer merely solving a puzzle, but anticipating the final act of a chess game. Only he could see Dot. We were shown into a small parlor by a soft-spoken maid who announced us in barely more than a whisper. A moment later, Mrs. Lydia Carr entered, a woman in her late 50s, sharp-boned, wrapped in heavy wool, and possessed of an air of polite reserve. "I assume," she said, "that you have come on account of Harold." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, madam? I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. We are investigating the circumstances surrounding Superintendent Moxby's untimely passing." She gave the barest nod and motioned for us to sit. "I doubt I can be of help. I had not seen Harold in nearly 2 years." "But you were once close," Holmes said gently. "He was your brother-in-law." "My sister Ellen was devoted to him. I was not. May I ask why?" Mrs. Carr hesitated, then answered with chilling clarity. "Because Harold Moxby broke her." There was a silence. Even Holmes seemed caught off guard by the directness of her reply. "Ellen was not strong," Mrs. Carr continued, "and Harold, he had his demons. He was never violent, you understand, but he was exacting, unforgiving. The man was obsessed with order and obedience. He applied that obsession to my sister. She died 4 years ago, did she not?" I asked softly. "She fell," Mrs. Carr said, her voice flat, "down the cellar stairs. They said it was an accident, but I never believed it." Holmes leaned forward. "Did she ever speak of being threatened? Of fearing him?" "She said strange things in her letters. That he watched her. That he kept records not of trains, but of her movements, her moods. He treated her like an employee." Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then, "And Percival March?" Mrs. Carr looked up sharply. "What of him? You knew him, did you not?" She hesitated. "He was a friend of Ellen's, before she married. I believe she wrote to him again in the last year of her life." "Letters?" Mrs. Carr's fingers twitched. "She never showed them to me, but she was calmer after they began, more hopeful." Holmes stood suddenly. "Thank you, Mrs. Carr. You have told us more than enough." She frowned. "Then you believe Harold was murdered?" Holmes gave her a ghost of a smile. "Madam, I believe Harold Moxby died exactly as he lived, under the impression that he was in full control of events, when, in fact, he was the subject of someone else's plan. We left her home without further explanation, and as we walked down the street, I turned to Holmes with a dozen questions swirling in my mind. You think March killed him for revenge? I think March may have loved a woman who was broken by control and humiliation, Holmes replied. But I do not think he intended to kill Harold Moxby. That part came later, when the plan unraveled. Then, what was his plan? To disgrace Moxby, to terrify him into resignation or public collapse. The illusion, the ghost of his late wife, the whistle failing to sound, it was all part of a pattern designed to make Moxby look unstable. But someone else took it further. Who? Holmes was silent a moment. Then, slowly, he said, "Let us return to the station, Watson. I must test a theory, and to do so I must perform a little theater of my own." We reached Blackbridge Junction just as dusk began to thicken the sky. Holmes requested the use of the signal tower once again, and, with a calm that belied his intensity, began setting the scene. He instructed a constable to dim the oil lamps, had 2 crates dragged from the yard to form a makeshift viewing gallery. Then he donned gloves and removed something from his coat pocket, a small round silver object with a polished face. "A watch?" I asked. "Of sorts," Holmes replied. "A fob of Moxby's. It was recovered from the tower, but not, I suspect, at the time of death." He placed it on the desk precisely where Moxby's body had been found and stepped back. "Watson," he said, "you will stand here as Moxby would have, watching the clock, waiting for the whistle's moment. I will be watching from outside." "From where?" "The same place where the illusion was projected." Before I could ask further, he had vanished out the door. I stood alone in the dim tower, the whistle replica clutched in my hand, the desk before me eerily familiar from the crime scene. The air felt tight, as if history still clung to the walls. Asterisk, I startled, my hand tightening reflexively around the whistle dot. Then Holmes was behind me again, stepping into the room. "Well?" he asked. He paused, glancing down at the floorboards. "Tomorrow I shall call them all back, one by one. The signalman, the clerk, the yardmaster's replacement, Miss Bell. To confront them?" "No," Holmes said quietly. "To provoke a reaction." Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again the following morning. Holmes summoned the principal station staff to the Junction's main office. He did so without ceremony, no written orders, no formal charges, only the quiet authority that seemed to accompany him wherever he moved. By 10 o'clock, Miss Bell, Lucy Travers, Constable Keene, and Acting Yardmaster Felix Dobbin had assembled under the low plaster ceiling of the dispatch office, all shifting uncomfortably in their chairs as Holmes stood before the soot darkened window, pipe in hand. Gregson arrived moments later, having received Holmes's request via telegram, and folded himself into a corner of the room with a grumble. Holmes began without preamble. "You are all here," he said, "because the death of Superintendent Harold Moxby is no longer being treated as a mere matter of fright, illusion, or accident. We are now in pursuit of a deliberate act, one carefully timed, expertly executed, and, until last night, incomplete." There was a collective stir. Dobbin frowned and crossed his arms. Miss Bell sat rigid, lips pursed. Lucy Travers's eyes widened, and she clasped her hands tighter in her lap. "I will speak to each of you," Holmes continued, "but first I ask only for your silence and your attention." He walked slowly to the table and placed a folded cloth bundle upon it. With a flick he revealed 3 items: the cracked mask, the whistle, and Moxby's pocket watch. "Each of these," he said, "was found after Moxby's death. Each was planted, and each tells a different version of the same lie." He let the silence stretch. Miss Bell finally spoke. "What do you mean, planted?" Holmes turned to her. "The mask and the whistle were meant to complete March's illusion after he fled, but the watch, it was not his." Gregson blinked. "Not March's?" "No," Holmes said. "It was removed from Moxby's body and replaced after his death, but the time was wrong 5 minutes fast. And more tellingly, it bore a partial fingerprint in the inner case." He turned to Lucy Travers. "Miss Travers, would you be so kind as to examine it?" She took the watch with shaking hands. I've never touched this." "Didn't you once study engraving?" Holmes asked mildly. "You have a jeweler's loupe on your keyring. You used to inscribe initials on commemorative pins in the station shop. A skilled engraver often wears gloves to avoid smudging the surface, but if one were hurried—" Lucy looked as though she might faint. "I didn't kill him," she whispered. "I don't believe you did," Holmes replied calmly. "But I believe you found the body before anyone else did. And I believe you tampered with the scene." Gregson straightened. "Why on earth would she do that?" Holmes gestured toward Miss Bell. "Because she was asked to." Miss Bell's jaw tensed. "You have no proof." "I have your ink smudge and the station's signal log," Holmes said. "You touched the logbook after Moxby was dead, Watson, and I examined it days ago. The entry was pristine except one page back, where the pen bled through. It wasn't Moxby's hand on that last line. It was yours." Miss Bell said nothing, but her eyes did not waver. Dobbin snorted. "So what? She wrote something down. That doesn't mean she staged a murder." "No," Holmes said softly, "but someone else did." He turned abruptly toward Dobbin. "Tell me, Mr. Dobbin, where were you between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m. on the night of Moxby's death?" "In the yard," Dobbin said coolly. "On patrol. Ask Keene." Keene nodded, though hesitantly. "I saw him near the junction fence around 2:45, he waved." "And what were you doing?" Holmes asked. "Nothing," Dobbin said. "Just checking the perimeter." But the perimeter had already been checked. Twice. In fact, Ruggles made a note in the log that you had no reason to be there that night, yet you insisted. Dobbin's jaw clenched. "I didn't know he made a note." "Exactly," Holmes said. The room went still. "You didn't expect Ruggles would survive long enough to contradict you. But when he did, you made him your scapegoat. Framed him, with access to the coal chute and the tunnel. Then you made sure the old disguise March had left behind would do the rest." Gregson stepped forward. "You're saying he finished March's plan?" "No," Holmes said. "He hijacked it." He looked squarely at Dobbin. "March may have wanted to drive Moxby mad, but someone else wanted him dead. Dobbin had the motive he was being disciplined for falsified shift logs, facing demotion. Moxby had recommended his dismissal the very week he died." Lucy gasped. Holmes pressed on. Dobbin knew about March's illusion plans. He overheard March speaking with Miss Bell outside the station. He bided his time. When March fled, Dobbin seized the opportunity. He entered the tower through the foundation hatch, using March's equipment. But he overdid it. The projection was too strong, the light too close, the mask too detailed. He shocked Moxby to death and then posed the scene. Dobbin rose abruptly. "You can't prove a word of that." Holmes tilted his head. "No? Then I suppose you won't mind that Constable Keene found this." Gregson stepped forward, holding a small canvas bag. "Recovered it this morning," he said, "from the base of the eastern tool shed, hidden behind the coal barrels." He opened it to reveal a lantern, an oil-stained glove, and a set of skeleton keys, including one that matched the hatch lock beneath the tower. Dobbin made a sudden lunge toward the door, but Keene, to his credit, moved with startling speed. He and Gregson wrestled the man to the ground in a flurry of limbs and curses. Holmes stood unshaken, eyes cool. "As I said, Watson," he murmured, "not a second act, but a second attempt." Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface that. Evening, as dusk descended upon London and the last trains pulled out from Blackbridge under flickering signal lights, Holmes and I returned to Baker Street. The rain had ceased, but a sharp wind had risen, cutting through the alleyways and rattling the panes of our sitting-room windows. Holmes had barely removed his coat before he took to the hearth. warming his hands with an uncharacteristic weariness. "You're unsettled," I observed. Holmes glanced at me, the flame-light dancing in his sharp eyes. "Because I am not yet certain where the truth ends and the theater begins. You exposed Dobbin. He had the motive, means, and opportunity." "Yes, and yet the motive still rings hollow," Holmes muttered. "Resentment over demotion? Fear of dismissal? These are serviceable motives, Watson, but not convincing ones. Dobbin was a parasite, but not a strategist. The sophistication of the illusion, the psychological finesse, it exceeds him." "Then you believe someone else was behind him?" "I believe someone used him," Holmes said quietly. "He finished what March had started, yes, but at whose bidding?" He paced before the fire in silence, pipe unlit, tapping the stem against his fingers, as if to draw out the answer. At last he turned to me. "Watson, recall Mrs. Lydia Carr's remark. Moxby broke her sister. A cruel man, yes, but also methodical, isolated, and unbending in his suspicion of betrayal. Now consider Miss Bell devoted, loyal, efficient. But she aided March, interfered with evidence, and remained at Moxby's side for over a year after his wife's death." "Why?" I frowned. "She said she pitied him." "Yes, but there is pity born of affection, and there is pity born of guilt." He paused. "You recall she confessed that March never meant to kill Moxby, only to unseat him?" "Yes." Holmes looked at me, eyes narrowing. "But what if someone saw March's plan as a means to a final reckoning, a way to deliver justice where the law had not?" There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a sealed envelope and a note. From the station, Mr. Holmes, messenger boy. Holmes took the letter, opened it, and read. As he did, something subtle in his expression shifted an edge, a sharpening of intent. He handed me the note dotted read. "I was wrong to help him, but you must know the rest. Come to the switchyard at midnight. Come alone. Bell?" I looked up sharply. "It's a trap," Holmes nodded. "Likely. Then you won't go?" "On the contrary," Holmes said, reaching for his coat. "I will go precisely because it is." By midnight we were in position. Holmes had taken a cab to the switchyard while I, against his instruction, but with his tacit approval, shadowed the perimeter at a safe distance, revolver in my coat pocket and heart thudding against my ribs. Switchyard was nearly deserted, the rails slick with frost. Shadows hung beneath the carriages like curtains. A lone signal lamp flickered at the far end, casting long beams over the metal tracks. Holmes waited in the open, arms crossed, as Miss Agatha Bell emerged from between two idle wagons. She was pale, drawn, and holding something in her hand papers. "You came," she said. "I keep appointments," Holmes replied. "Even those extended under duress," she flinched. "I didn't know he'd die. I never wanted that." "Who are you protecting, Miss Bell?" She didn't answer. Instead, she held out the pages, letters, from Ellen Mrs. Moxby, found in March's desk, hidden behind false drawers. He never sent them, but he copied them. I thought he burned. The rest. Holmes took them and glanced through the first. I moved quietly closer to read over his shoulder. The writing was unsteady, each letter more fragile than the last. "Harold watches everything, even my breathing. I cannot laugh, cannot sing. He says laughter is for the undisciplined." March wrote again. I remember his voice, his kindness, I think I made a terrible mistake." Another, dated weeks before her death. "March has returned to London. He says I must leave, but how can I? I am my husband's prisoner in all but—" Miss Bell gasped. Percival Holmes narrowed his eyes. "You never left London?" "No," March said. "I vanished into the tunnels. I meant only to frighten Moxby, but when I heard he'd died, when I saw Dobbin had twisted it, I couldn't stay hidden." "Then you'll surrender?" I asked. March nodded slowly. "I will, but not until Miss Bell is cleared. She didn't kill Moxby. I did, though I never meant to." Holmes's eyes flickered. "The law may not care for the distinction, but—" "I do." He gestured toward the path back. "Come, let us end the illusion. It is time the curtain falls." Chapter 11. The Bait Holmes' Grand Strategy. By the time the first coal carts of the morning clattered across the southern line, Holmes had already laid the framework for his final maneuver. He rose early, foregoing breakfast entirely, and dispatched 3 telegrams from the post station down the street. He then returned to Baker Street, requested my assistance in retrieving a bundle from the bureau, and spent the next hour modifying what appeared to be a weather-beaten railway uniform. "Holmes," I said, watching him stitch a narrow hem into the cuff of the coat with clinical precision, "you don't mean to go under cover?" "Not quite, Watson," he replied, "but I intend to be invisible. That, in our present circumstances, is much the same thing." "You're planning a trap." Holmes didn't look up. "The trap has already been baited. We've merely been too occupied with the web of illusions to see it. But the final spider, yes, that one is still hiding." "You believe March didn't act alone, then?" "I believe March performed the act," Holmes said, "but someone else applied the stage. You saw his face last night haunted." "Yes, but not calculating. His grief was genuine. And Agatha Bell's confession, if anything, cleared more smoke than it cast." He stood, set the altered uniform on a hanger, and turned to me with that rare glint that only ever appeared when the full structure of a mystery had revealed itself to him, layer upon layer, like shutters drawn back from a house at night. "Watson, the theater of this crime is collapsing, but before the curtain falls I intend to bring the last hidden player into the light. We return to Blackbridge this evening. I shall need you to do 3 things. Name them. First, speak with Inspector Gregson and request that March and Miss Bell be held quietly until I send word. Second, deliver this uniform to Constable Keene, with instructions to meet me outside the signal tower at 11 p.m. sharp. And third," he paused, "be ready for the unexpected." The evening mist rolled over the switchyard in long, ghostly waves, blurring lanterns and painting the tracks with soft shadow. By the time I arrived with Keene, Holmes was already waiting disguised in the modified railway uniform, cap low, hands in his pockets like any anonymous workman shifting through the fog. "Keene," he said, "you will remain posted inside the tower. Do not interfere, no matter what you hear. You'll know when to move." "Yes, sir," Keene said, clearly nervous. Holmes turned to me. "Watson, stay out of view but nearby. We cannot afford to lose our guest in the dark." "What guest?" "The one who believes the game is over and intends to silence March before the past can rise any further." Holmes disappeared into the fog. I waited, crouched behind a stack of lumber, revolver tucked in my coat. The yard was quiet now, Even the usual clanks and mutters had vanished. A thin wind moved between the rail cars, carrying the faint whistle of the eastern line far off, like the memory of something unfinished. At precisely 11:27 p.m., I saw movement. A tall figure in a dark cloak passed along the northern fence line, then cut southward toward the base of the tower. The figure paused, looked around, then slipped through the outer hatch Holmes had once identified beneath the levers. 10 minutes later, I saw Holmes, still in disguise, emerge from the shadows and circle to the rear. With uncanny silence he followed. I waited. A minute passed. Then from the tower a sharp noise, metal on wood. A crash. Holmes's voice called out, not loud, but firm. "You're too late. March is gone." Another voice answered a man's, but one I did not recognize immediately. Harsh, panicked. No, he can't talk. He can't. "You were the architect, weren't you?" Holmes replied. "March built the illusion, but you designed the fear." I moved toward the base of the tower and ascended the steps silently. Inside, the scene froze as I stepped through the door. Holmes stood calmly beside the semaphore levers, now backlit by the storm lantern hanging from the ceiling. Across from him, illuminated starkly, stood Percival March's former supervisor and the station's head of supply, Edward Branton, a man I had barely registered in earlier days at the yard. Nondescript, middle-aged, a pencil pusher, his features now twisted with fury. "You don't understand," Branton hissed. Moxby was going to expose everything. The payments, the smuggled manifests. He found the receipts. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And so you manipulated March, fed him the fire he needed." "I gave him nothing," Branton snarled. "He was already broken. I just redirected him." "You saw an opportunity," Holmes said quietly. "March's hatred, Moxby's obsession. You added just enough heat to the boiler and waited for it to burst." Branton stepped forward. "I was this close to freedom. Moxby gone, March disappeared, and the station back under my control. I could have cleared the books by spring." "You staged the whistle failure," Holmes said. "You moved the timetable. You created the fake echoes from the riverbank. You supplied Dobbin the means to finish the illusion when March fled." Branton's hands trembled. "I never laid a finger on Moxby." "No," Holmes said, "but you built the moment that killed him." Then a shout came from below, the creak of boots on stairs. Gregson's voice, "Stay where you are." Branton spun, but Holmes stepped calmly into his path, blocking the exit. Within seconds, 2 constables stormed the room and seized the man before he could flee. Gregson, catching his breath, looked from Branton to Holmes. "So he's the spider." Holmes nodded. And like all spiders, he thought his web unseen. Branton struggled, then slumped. "You fools. Do you even know what it's worth? Those roots, those schedules, they're more valuable than gold." "Moxby would have ruined everything." Holmes turned away. "Yes, and in doing so he was finally right about one thing. Someone was watching." Chapter 12. The Moment of Recognition. It was well past midnight when we returned to Baker Street, but Holmes showed no inclination to sleep. The fog still clung to the city like a damp shroud, and the flicker of gas lamps along Baker Street seemed softer, somehow, as if the night itself had finally exhaled. Holmes tossed his overcoat over a chair and went directly to the mantel. He stood there for a moment unmoving before finally striking a match and lighting the fire. I could see the muscles in his jaw working. "You're troubled," I said, settling into my chair across from him. He didn't look at me. "What troubles?" Watson, is not the complexity of the case, it is its symmetry." I frowned. "Symmetry?" Holmes turned then, eyes sharp and unreadable. "The crime, Watson, was not merely one of opportunity or even revenge. It was an orchestration. Each player performed their role as if guided by an invisible conductor. Moxby's death was the crescendo, but the melody began long before March ever returned to London." I nodded slowly. "Branton saw it all, didn't he? He watched Moxby isolate himself, break his wife, alienate his staff, and when March returned he saw a chance." "He did more than see it," Holmes murmured. "He nurtured it, fed it with fragments of truth, half-truths, and just enough provocation to ensure it ignited at precisely the right moment." He moved to the desk and unfolded the letters Agatha Bell had given him earlier that night. "These were the kindling," he said softly. "March didn't invent the illusion. He simply amplified a reality Moxby himself had already built. And Branton merely rearranged the shadows." He held up one of the letters, then another. "Here," he said, tapping the paper. "This one dated only 3 weeks before Ellen Moxby's death. It says, 'I told him I would leave. He said I had no right, that everything I was belonged to him, even my thoughts.'" Holmes handed me the letter without looking. "And this another from the same week. 'I have taken to walking the yard at night. March writes that there is still beauty in the world. I believe him. I believe it's possible to be free, but I am afraid." I read the passages in silence. There was something haunting in them, not just sadness, but resignation, the desperate clarity of a person who knows they are fading and can only observe their own decline. Holmes returned to the hearth. He stared into the flames. "Moxby's crime was never murder," he said at last. "It was control. Absolute, inescapable control. It devoured his wife. It stifled his subordinates. And it attracted men like Branton, who thrive in shadows where no one speaks freely." I sat back. "You knew it from the beginning, didn't you? That it wasn't just about the whistle?" Holmes gave a faint smile. "When you hear silence where sound should be, Watson, you must ask why it wasn't made. That whistle, the one Moxby was to blow, was not merely a signal. It was a ritual, a test of authority, a declaration of power." I looked up sharply. "You think he hesitated?" "I think he intended to blow it," Holmes said, "but something made him pause. Perhaps it was the image March projected, or perhaps it was something simpler, a moment of doubt. And in that instant, the illusion triumphed. Moxby died not because of fear alone, but because his certainty, for the first time, cracked. He turned to me then, and his voice was low. 'That is what killed him, Watson. Not smoke or mirrors, but doubt. The loss of control in a man, when it suited him, but he lacked the clarity of vision necessary to design something so intricately psychological.'" "You suspect someone else?" I asked, startled. "I do," Holmes replied. "Branton tried to extinguish March and cover his own schemes, but there is a missing element, a ghost within the ghost, if you like, someone who disappeared far too early, and with far too much knowledge. Before I could press further, Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes took it with a nod and read it silently. Then, with a sharp breath, as I feared, March has escaped. What? Holmes handed me the telegram. It was from Gregson. March escaped during transfer. Guard overpowered. Nitrogen monoxide trace. Alerting all stations. Possible aid from within. I stared at it. He fled? But why now? Because he knows we're close, Holmes said grimly. He knows the game is almost up, and he's gambling that one final move might reset the board. He turned to the hearth, eyes narrowing. And that means only one thing, Watson. He has unfinished business. We returned to Blackbridge Junction by late afternoon. Gregson, flustered and scowling, met us on the platform and led us into the station-master's office, where the atmosphere was taut with unease. He vanished some time before dawn, Gregson explained. Left a false trail through the coal. Chute must have timed it with the guard change. We've checked the yards, the tunnels, even the abandoned signal room. Nothing. Who else had access? Holmes asked. Gregson grimaced. Only Travers and Bell. The rest were locked down. Holmes looked sharply at him. And Miss Bell? Still at the constable's quarters. Distraught, but cooperative. Keep her under watch, Holmes said. No contact with outside staff, and post a man at the old theater on Canning Row. The theater? Holmes didn't elaborate. Instead, he pulled me aside as Gregson left the room. Watson, March's mind is patterned like a stage script acts, cues, controlled tension. His escape wasn't flight, it was entrance. He has no intention of hiding. Then what's his next move? To rewrite the ending, Holmes said. He paused, then added, We must bait him out again. But this time we will let him write the scene and alter only the final line. That night, Blackbridge Junction was sealed. All unnecessary personnel were dismissed, and only those under Holmes's explicit instruction were permitted near the signal tower. Holmes returned to the very chamber where Moxby had died and sat in the same chair, posture precise, hands folded in his lap like a man awaiting a performance. I remained below in the adjacent storeroom, where Holmes had arranged a viewing peephole behind a false supply cabinet. For a long while, nothing happened. Then, just after midnight, I heard it a soft creak above, followed by the scrape of the door bolt. A figure stepped inside. Holmes did not move. Good evening, Mr. March, he said calmly. You knew? Came the reply, low, hoarse, almost a whisper. You always knew I would come back. Of course. You're not finished. And men like you can never bear an incomplete illusion. March stepped forward into the lantern light. His face had changed in the past days, gaunt, pale, and yet eerily calm. Holmes continued, You escaped not to flee, but to complete something. You still believe the truth hasn't been told. March's voice trembled now. Because it hasn't. You think it's about Moxby, about control, about fear. But that's only half of it. He reached into his coat. I tensed behind the wall, hand on my revolver. Holmes didn't flinch. You see, March said, pulling out a crumpled envelope. There was a second set of letters, Ellen's final ones. She sent them to me just days before she died. I never shared them, not even with Bell. He placed the envelope on the table. Holmes reached for it, slowly. They speak of Branton, March said. Of blackmail. She learned something, an arrangement between Moxby and Branton regarding illegal shipments. She threatened to expose them. That's why she died. Holmes scanned the letter. His eyes darkened. "I see," he murmured. And that's what you wanted the world to know." "I wanted him ruined," March said, "but I never meant to kill him. Until the final night I thought I could make him confess. The ghost was a mirror, but he didn't see it. He just froze." He collapsed into the second chair, breathing heavily. Holmes waited. "I came here," March whispered, "because I wanted you to see the truth, and then I would disappear. But I can't." "No," Holmes said gently. "You came here because, like any actor, you cannot leave the stage without a final bow." Then the door burst open. Gregson, Keene, and 2 constables stormed in. Weapons drawn. March did not resist. He simply closed his eyes. As they took him away, Holmes stood by the desk, holding the final letter in his hand. He did not speak for a long time. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed. It was just past 4 o'clock in the morning when Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, our boots damp with yard grime, and our minds still heavy with the weight of Percival March's final confession. Though the fire had gone cold in the hearth, Holmes declined Mrs. Hudson's offer of tea or a warming brandy. Instead, he placed Ellen Moxby's last letter on the table between us and sat in silence, fingertips pressed together, his expression one of grim satisfaction tinged with deep contemplation. He did not speak until the first pale wash of dawn crept through the curtains. "Watson," he said quietly, "the illusion is now complete, and with it, so too is the truth." I leaned forward. March's escape, his return to the signal tower, the hidden letter, it's all more than just confession, isn't it? Indeed. The letter was not merely a revelation, it was the missing keystone in an architectural marvel of deception. It told us not just why Ellen died, but how the crime concealed itself within layers of misdirection. He retrieved the page and held it carefully, as though it might crumble from age or memory. The script was shakier than the earlier letters, yet the emotion pressed between each line was raw, unmistakable. I saw the ledger again tonight. Harold tried to hide it in the cellar, but I recognized the markings, those strange abbreviations, the same ones I'd seen on Branton's rail sheets. It frightened me. I know now something illegal is happening at Blackbridge. I must tell someone. I've written to March. Holmes placed the letter flat against the table and tapped the bottom line. "If anything happens to me, someone must look beneath the signal tower." That is where it began. "Beneath the signal tower," I repeated aloud. "But we already searched the foundation." "Yes, we did," Holmes said. "But they did not expect we would return to it once Branton and March were both accounted for." He stood abruptly and moved to the bureau, retrieving a folded sheet of tracing vellum. He spread it out across the table, revealing a crude map of the station foundations, crawl spaces, and the disused coal chute. March knew about the hatch beneath the levers. Branton used it. Dobbin entered through it. But this space here. Holmes pointed to a square recess behind the tower's base on the northern edge of the plan, unmarked in the official registry. "This is not on any current blueprint." I studied the mark. "A storage vault?" "Originally," Holmes said, "but I believe it was repurposed. A hiding place, one that neither March nor Miss Bell knew existed. And that is where the real evidence lies." He looked up sharply. "Watson, we return to Blackbridge immediately. The final clue is not in a letter or a voice. It is something material, hidden beneath the feet of every suspect, and presumed erased." By 8 o'clock, Holmes had secured Gregson's support once more. The signal tower was cleared, and under Holmes's instruction, a pair of workmen with picks and crowbars set about prying up the warped floorboards near the northern support beam, precisely where the map had indicated a sub-chamber might lie dotted. Took less than an hour. With a loud snap and groan, the old wood gave way, revealing a square cavity, barely large enough for a man to lie down in. The air that escaped was stale and bitter with coal dust. Gregson knelt first, lifting a cloth bundle wrapped in tarred oilskin. He unrolled it carefully on the floor, revealing its contents. A small accounting ledger, browned with age, its cover marked only with the initials H.M., a stack of rail schedules, all bearing alternate notations routes, cargo weights, and delivery times that differed from the official records. And finally, a set of receipts, stamped and signed, showing off the book's transfers of industrial goods to unauthorized docks on the Thames. Holmes crouched and examined each with a jeweler's care. "Precisely as I suspected," he said. This was Moxby's own insurance policy. He kept a second set of records, ones that implicated Branton and others in years of illegal freight diversion. Likely he meant to confront Branton at last, but Ellen found them first. Gregson scowled. So Branton wasn't just manipulating March. He was covering up something very real. "Exactly," Holmes said, and he nearly succeeded in wrapping the entire affair in a tale of ghostly vengeance. Had March not returned to unearth the truth, this chamber might never have been opened. I held up the receipts. "There are other names here, Holmes." "Indeed," he replied. "Some of them quite senior. This case will not end with Branton's cell door." Gregson stood and sighed. "I'll have to contact the transport ministry. Quietly, if possible." Holmes straightened, dusted his hands, and offered a thin smile. "Let us hope, Inspector, that they are more concerned with truth than reputation." As the morning wore on and Blackbridge slowly returned to life, Holmes and I stood for a time outside the signal tower, watching the sun cast long golden beams across the metal rails. There was a strange calm in the air, something that Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The days that followed brought with them a curious calm, the kind that arrives only after the closing of something vast and uncertain. And yet at Baker Street that calm was not without tension, for Holmes remained, restive, moving between his chair and the window, examining dispatches from Scotland Yard with a surgeon's precision, and marking the edges of newspapers with marginal notes in his spidery hand. "Justice. Watson," he said one morning as he set aside a letter from Inspector Gregson, "is a slow-moving train, but when it finally arrives it tends to grind thoroughly over those who stand in its way." He gestured to the stack of documents now growing beside the fireplace. "Branton's web is unraveling. The ministry has confirmed that 5 freight captains and 2 senior logistics clerks have been placed under investigation. At least 3 ports on the Thames have been implicated." "And Branton himself?" I asked. "Detained at Newgate. He will face trial under both criminal and commercial statutes. Fraud, corruption, and if March's confession is ruled admissible, conspiracy to commit murder." I sat back in my chair, relieved. but still pondering the deeper resonance of the affair. And what of March? Holmes hesitated, then reached for another envelope. He remains in custody, he said. But public sentiment, as well as the judiciary, is not blind to nuance. His confession, delivered freely combined with the corroboration from Miss Bell and the recovered letters, has complicated the case. He may not face a hanging. Do you believe that would be just? Holmes considered. I believe March was not innocent, but I also believe he was not wicked. He set in motion a mechanism he could no longer control, and for that he will pay, though perhaps not in the usual ways. He opened the envelope and handed me the contents, a single page, handwritten in elegant, deliberate strokes. Asterisk, asterisk, from Percival March to Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I am grateful, not for your clemency, which you never offered, nor for your judgment, which you never spared, but for your truth, for your ability to see through fog, through story, through guilt. I loved Ellen, and I failed her. You were right. The ghost I summoned was not hers. It was mine. Tell Miss Bell. I'm sorry. And thank you. Asterisk, asterisk, I read it twice before setting it down. Sure want to hear that, I said quietly. Holmes nodded. She's gone, by the way. Resigned her post at the station, left a forwarding address only to Travers. I expect she returned to her sister's home in Kent. And Travers, still clerking, said she finds peace in the rhythm of the telegraph. He stood and turned to the window, watching as smoke from a distant locomotive curled into the late morning sky. You see, Watson, for all the theater and deception, for all the tragedy layered into that lonely tower, it was a railway clerk who heard the faintest note of truth and dared to whisper it aloud. He stepped away from the window, poured himself a measure of tea, and settled finally into his chair. It was not March's mask that destroyed Moxby, nor Branton's schemes. It was the accumulation of silence, of all the things unspoken, unchallenged. Ellen Moxby died unheard. Her husband, locked in his own machinery of control, collapsed not from fear, but from recognition. He saw himself and could not bear it. We sat in thoughtful quiet, the soft ticking of the mantel clock, the only sound between us, died at last. Holmes reached for his violin. The bow moved slowly across the strings, not in one of his manic improvisations, but with quiet, solemn reverence. A simple melody, reflective, forgiving. When he finished, he looked up. I dare say, Watson, I am weary of ghosts. As am I. And yet, as I wrote the final lines of my account that evening, I could not help but imagine the signal tower at Blackbridge empty now, quiet, perhaps condemned to be rebuilt. And yet I wondered, if one stood there in the hour before dawn, would they still hear the faint echo of a whistle that was never blown? Or would they simply hear silence, the kind that follows when justice finally has been served? ChatGPT said, Chapter 18, Holmes' Final Reflection. The spring arrived in London with a gentleness that seemed almost apologetic, as if the city itself sought to make amends for the cruelty of winter's passing. The soot-streaked bricks of Baker Street gleamed faintly under a softer sun, and the hum of carriages was more leisurely now, more human. But within the familiar walls of 221B, the man I knew best remained unchanged in all but one small, telling way. Sherlock Holmes, ever the embodiment of relentless clarity, had grown quieter, not withdrawn nor melancholic. Merely reflective. 1. Afternoon, several weeks after the formal closure of the Blackbridge affair, I found him seated not with his violin or his newspaper, but with a worn volume of railway history, his fingers idly tapping the margin of a chapter entitled Signals and Systems of Control. He did not notice my arrival until I set 2 cups of tea beside him. "Ah, Watson," he said, without looking up, still determined to domesticate me with warm beverages. "And you still believe deduction trumps digestion?" He allowed himself the faintest smile, then closed the book and leaned back in his chair, gazing at nothing in particular. "You've completed your narrative, I presume?" "Yes," I replied. "The case is written, documented, and in a few days will be delivered to my publisher. I've titled it The Whistle That Wasn't Blown." Holmes nodded. "Fitting." I studied him for a moment. "You haven't spoken of it since March's sentencing." Holmes exhaled softly. "Because there is little left to say. The facts, as you would put it, are settled. March is to serve 10 years under leniency. Branton will not see freedom again. Dobbin was found hanged in his cell, an act of cowardice or conscience, depending on one's generosity. And MOX by ... double quotes. Moxby is gone. But I wonder whether he ever truly lived beyond the system he built." I nodded. The judge said March's crime was one of emotional manipulation, not physical violence. I suppose that's why they were merciful. "Mercy," Holmes said, "is what remains when the law exhausts its appetite for retribution. And in this case I do not begrudge it. March constructed an illusion, but only because the truth had become unbearable." He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small object, a brass whistle, its surface dulled with age, the same one recovered from Moxby's lifeless grip. "I've kept it," he said, turning it slowly in his fingers, "as a reminder." "Of what?" Holmes was quiet for a long time before he answered. "Of what happens when control replaces understanding, when observation is used not to learn, but to dominate. When a man no longer sees people as human, but as pieces of a machine." He set the whistle on the desk and pushed it gently toward me. "You see, Watson, Moxby was never murdered in the traditional sense. His death was not caused by March or Branton or even Ellen's letters. It was death by culmination by years of isolating himself from the very humanity he was tasked with leading." He looked up at me. "And that, I fear, is the most dangerous kind of death, the one that begins long before the heart stops beating." I felt a heaviness settle in the room, not sorrow, but the weight of knowing, the understanding that even justice cannot undo what time has eroded. I stood, then, and walked to the mantel, where I'd placed a small brass frame days earlier. Within it a modest photograph, Ellen Moxby, seated in a garden chair, sunlight. In her hair, eyes distant, but not without hope. A face too long forgotten by those who should have remembered her. "She was never a ghost," I said aloud. "Just a voice no one wanted to hear." Holmes joined me at the hearth. For once he did not speak. He only nodded. We stood there together as the sun crept down the edge of the window pane, illuminating the dust that hung motionless in the air. And in that silence, true, perfect, and without illusion, I realized that some mysteries are solved, not by finding what is hidden, but by finally seeing what was always in plain sight. Holmes turned at last retrieving his violin from its case. With the gentlest of strokes he began to play not a triumphant tune, nor a mournful dirge, but something simpler, something unfinished, something real.